Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Well, this is an interesting process being in front of you today. Roger called and asked if I would speak, and I originally said no, and I said, oh, I'm busy, I'm in school, and I'm working, and then I had kind of gone through a journey with the two women that I'm going to be sharing with you today, and as I thought about it, I've always admired Roger's commitment to his ministry, which is professionally speaking, and when I got off after I said no, I thought about it and I said, there are a lot of times that we say we want to contribute, but unless we move our feet and take action, then we're not being true to what we say we believe. So I called them back, and then the next challenge came when I was thinking about, okay, emotional intelligence, I'm comfortable with the subject, but do I talk about the subject in a personal way or a business way? And I said, I'm the speaker, I can do what I want, right? So I said, I'm going to share a personal journey, and I will tell all of you up front, this is relatively new, this journey, and it is still raw with me. And so if I get emotional, hang in there with me, because there's important things to share, and I really want to do that around the context of emotional intelligence. So I want to share with you a situation with my sister Lori. Lori, in July of 2007, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And for those of you who have either been diagnosed with cancer or have gone through that with someone that you know, cancer is first of all, the word itself for me was overwhelming. I was just immediately groped with fear when Lori was diagnosed. And long story short, she had a mastectomy on one side of the body, and then a few months later had to go in and have another mastectomy because they found more lumps. So that was really tough. And then when they did the second mastectomy, she almost died because after the surgery went well, but there was internal bleeding. And that she wasn't monitored to any kind of, she wasn't being monitored. So usually you're fine, you go into a room, you sleep. But the internal bleeding they didn't catch, and it was just kind of by happenstance that a nurse came in and she had passed out, and my dad got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning saying, Lori's been rushed into emergency surgery. So that was the one piece. And then the other piece is I have had a friend that I had loved dearly since 3rd grade, and for the last 11, 12 years lived across the street from her as well. And her name is Lori too. And she and I had known each other since 3rd grade, spent a lot of time together. And Lori was diagnosed in October of '07. She had a grand mal seizure in October, and from there was later diagnosed with brain cancer, glioblastoma multiforme. And she died this December. And so why this subject is really important is along the way, each of them had very personal experiences. And I was very aware how people's lack of self-awareness impacted them. And I wanted to just share 3 examples. My friend Lori worked at a school, and this is a school that helps troubled teenagers. The school, when Lori had her diagnosis, and especially if anyone has been around someone with brain cancer, it really affects your cognitive abilities as well as your physical abilities. You're not able to finish sentences, you're not able to focus, you lose the balance. There are a lot of times these individuals have strokes. Fortunately, Lori never did. But so when when that disease really started to manifest, the school wanted to bring in counselors so people could talk about how it was impacting them. Now, again, how it was impacting them, not how they could provide support to Lori. And that really hurt her. And I remember she came over that evening and said, Tracy, am I wrong, or is something off about this? And I said, and I would get really riled up, and we would laugh about it, but I'd say, no, Lori, it's inappropriate. That if there's any sort of counseling, the counseling seems to me that this is about you. This is not about them. So that was one situation. The other situation involved with my sister, she too has a best friend since grade school, and her best friend never came to see her through the 2 mastectomies, through all the time she was home. And what her friend told her was she just couldn't do it. So again, that pointed out to me this was about her friend. And then unfortunately, even my mother, still today, cannot say the word cancer. She refers to this as Lori's situation. So again, when Roger called, this really brought to me the importance of self-awareness. And so I want to really talk about that right now. And keeping in mind, my sister today, I'm very blessed, and she's blessed. She's doing well. We're working out every night in the evenings. And I was, reminded of the importance of self-awareness. Last night I was looking at my notes, and my friend Lori, her son, who was 19, called and said, "Can I get some water, please?" And he was really struggling with the loss of his mother. And so I'll talk more about that. But right now I want you to move to the handouts on your table. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, thank you, Larry. When we talk about emotional intelligence, I like to really talk about the work of Daniel Goleman. I have to say that Daniel Goleman wasn't the forerunner of emotional intelligence. There is another individual, Peter Salovey, I believe, Salovey, who was originally the front runner for the research in emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman was a smart researcher and marketed it, the emotional intelligence. But I like the Daniel Goleman model because it's very friendly in terms of a business context. So when we think about emotional intelligence, the first 2 bullets, we're really talking about how well do you know yourself. So how well do you know yourself? How perceptive are you in terms of identifying your behavior, your emotions in relationship to others? And that's what, again, I want to go back to those 3 examples I shared with my sister's close friend and Lori's work, and the need for others to do processing when it should have been about her. And when we're talking about when we recognize or don't recognize our own feelings, there's this tendency to kind of invade other people's space. And it's, to me, it's almost a subtle form of narcissism, because your need takes over the need of the individual. And so emotional intelligence means, quite simply, that we're aware, that we are aware around our emotions. Like, I had to acknowledge to you, this is raw for me. It's my first time talking about it in a kind of a quasi-business setting. So there's some emotions, and that's just going to be the way it is right now for a particular period of time. And a good example of emotional intelligence, as it was mentioned, I'm really proud of being an aunt. I don't have children, so I love my 3 nephews, and I really love finally that one of my sisters gave me a niece. And Nina is 5 years old, going on 15. But when my sister was going through her cancer, the self-awareness really became apparent to me when we had been doing a really good job of talking to Miles and Nina. Miles is 7, about what was going on with my sister. But at one point we forgot to tell them ahead of time that Lori no longer had hair. And so when Miles and Nina walked into the kitchen and saw Lori with no hair, Miles pointed at her and laughed and said, "You look funny." Nina cried, and it scared her. And so that really talked about, we forgot to really think about how they would feel about just something what we would assume would be as simple as hair. But once we talked Nina through that, she was much better. And so again, oftentimes adults, we can become very intertwined with the day-to-day issues that we forget to really explain what's going on to kids. And I think kids are very resilient with the structure and those conversations. So again, we're really talking about recognizing our own feelings. And another important piece of emotional intelligence is recognizing our impact on others. I mean, that is very important. And so what I want to do is go down to the bottom of the first page, and this is the particular framework. And Goleman calls these competencies, emotional intelligence competencies. And competencies really can be defined as behavior and skills. And this particular model, the 4 quadrants, you can't get to the last quadrant, which is relationship management, until you've mastered self-awareness. And in my practice working with organizations, I have found if you cannot get people to the area of self-awareness, you might as well just check your work off as a transaction or an event. And the challenge is, how do we provide enough feedback and dialogue where we're really moving that behavior? And if we can move individual behavior, we can move organizational behavior. And in many respects, I no longer do work with leadership teams unless I can use assessments. And the reason is, when someone is in front of me, I'm experiencing their worldview, their perception. But what I can do with assessments is get a lot more data on what's below the surface. Some of you may be familiar with an iceberg. And if you think about an iceberg, you have below the surface the values, the traits, what I would call really the driving forces around an organization, regardless of what the policies say. So again, in self-awareness, the 3 competencies here are emotional self-awareness, accurate self-assessment, and self-confidence. And I can't stress enough the importance of self-confidence, because when people are not confident, I would say their behavior just kind of spreads. And there's what I would call an emotional hijacking that goes on when people lack confidence. Or we could call it, if people want to go fishing, and then they throw it out. They throw out, I'm not a fisher, but what's that? Thank you. Okay, throw out the cast. And then you hook someone, right? So now I have a willing participant. And so we get distracted from the issue at hand. And so again, the area of self-confidence is very important. And so when we talk about emotional intelligence, let's look at the second page. With the 3 competencies, the first, emotional self-awareness, reading one's emotions and recognizing their impact, using gut sense to guide decisions. And fortunately, there's a lot more academic research being conducted around the importance of intuition in business. And that's all I'll say about that, because I really want to have time at the end of this for your questions. And here the second one is knowing your strengths and limits. And again, I'll use myself as example. I had to really tell you my limit around my abilities today to deliver what it was I wanted to share. And I'm okay with that. So we just have to be comfortable around saying what we don't know. But the real question is, do you have the ability to work with others to get that knowledge, and can you acquire it on your own? And I'm a big believer of, don't spend a lot of time trying to give people skills they don't have. If overall they're a strong performer, partner them in a team or with individuals that have that skill. And when I was managing people in my younger years, I would, want to hire just like me. And that was the worst thing I could do. I don't like a lot of detail. So I would always, as I matured and had more wisdom, I started to hire individuals who did not have all of the skills that I had. And then once I hired them, I gave them the flexibility in the room to drive those areas of projects. There's nothing worse than you hire strong people and you bring them in the door and you squash them, and you don't want them to use all of their skills. And so the last one, again, is self-confidence. Do you know your self-worth and your capabilities? And what is really important also about emotional intelligence and creating this self-awareness, companies and individuals spend a lot of time looping. I just call them loops. And 4 years ago, in the handout that I shared, I called it a stuck state cycle, that you continuously and unconsciously make the same choices. And that's a real issue. And again, in the case of going back to both Lori's, they really needed people to acknowledge what they were going through, and they needed support in a way that was unique to them. And you know, I think it's pretty difficult for a mother not to be able to say the word that my daughter has cancer, and not to be able to embrace your daughter and say, I'm sorry you have cancer. You know, and I also think what's really important about self-awareness is that when people are going through critical points in their life, if you do not have self-awareness, you just continually, we create kind of these voids in people's lives. And I know that when my friend Lori and I would talk about her dying, and as that went on over the 14 months, a lot of times we would cry together, and where I was really stuck with her was I didn't know what to say to her regarding leaving her 2 children, a 19 and 8-year-old. And I would say to her, Lori, I'm not a mother. I said, but as an aunt, I can't imagine that, and I don't know how you do that, and you're living with that knowledge. But she could really appreciate that I could say that to her. And oftentimes she just needed to have validation, and she did not want people to tell her she wasn't dying, because when you read the diagnosis and all the ailments around the glioblastoma multiforme, it's almost identical in terms of what individuals go through, and so traumatic that her life insurance gave her 50% of the policy while she was living. And that's almost unheard of, being paid out to some degree on your life insurance while you're still living. So what I want to do is go to this, there's a step here, a 5-step process. And again, it talks about the ideal self. Are you the person that you would like to be? And there's a real challenge with emotional intelligence because it requires some really basic areas. Number one, it requires that people are given constant feedback. And that's why I like using assessments. It requires that people can be engaged in dialogue with people who are different and who come from different walks of life. It also requires courage. And if you're in an organization, it also requires that when people are giving dialogue, that there are no kind of punitive repercussions from giving that dialogue. And so again, the only way that we can start to really have movement in that area is around just the basics. And sometimes we complicate these areas so much that it gets in the way of doing the daily dialogue. So this second area is real self. Do you have a vision of your ideal self? And one of the questions we'll look at under self-reflection is, oftentimes I ask people, do you have areas in your life that keep coming at you, like you get this small whisper inside, and you almost you know you need to do this work because it keeps coming up, or you get similar feedback from different places, from different people who don't know each other. You get this similar feedback at work, you get the similar feedback in your relationships. That's something to really pay attention to, but that really also comes down to is this vision of yourself. And what I can honestly say about with my sister and my friend, what was really important to me and why self-awareness was important to me was just at a basic fundamental level, I loved these 2 women and I wanted to be there for them. But that, as simple as that sounds, that can be very difficult because there were times along the journey that I had strong opinions about something should be different or they should do something differently. But again, this self-awareness for me, I could catch myself. And if I said something or did something that wasn't in a kind of an alignment to what they needed, I could also go back and acknowledge that. And this number 3 is the learning agenda. I think it is critical to be lifelong learners. And again, I have learned a lot even from my nephews and my niece. And learning doesn't only come in the way of a book, but it requires us to say, can I do something differently? Is what I was doing 5 years ago, does that still work today? And sometimes there can be a rigidity, and there's a comfort in routine. But that comfort in routine doesn't allow for new growth. I mean, when I was in the workplace with one client, and there was someone who was very young, and I was talking to him, and he went back to his desk, and then I went back, I was calling him because we were very close in location to one another, and he had his iPod on. You know, and it occurred to me, oh, I'm working with someone much younger. And you know, and then shortly after that, I saw an article, and it talked about how rude iPods were in the workplace, and that it really gives the message that, oh, people aren't listening. I'm thinking, I have sat in front of people face to face, ears wide open, didn't hear me. What did an iPod have to do with anything? And it really showed that we, you know, I would say the more seasoned workers, you know, and you can go the other direction on the spectrum. All of us have a responsibility to look at new ways of doing things. So I think the learning agenda is very important. Number 4, reconfiguring the brain. This is a tough one, and this to me takes several years. 4 years ago, when I talked about emotional intelligence, I talked about the challenges I've had in my life around behaviors and my temper. It takes a long time to change. And again, what we do, it's natural. It feels, you know, it's kind of a natural tendency. We've done it for so long. Even if it's dysfunctional, we know it. But to change that behavior also means, again, feedback. And it means that when people give us feedback, we need that feedback to be in a way that is timely and with specific examples. And people need to know, what's the impact of my behavior? The last area is the power of relationships. And that's twofold. There will be people, as you change, your world changes. And if you think you're going to change and keep everyone in your life the same, that may not apply, because it shifts the dynamics. And it's not always easy when someone changes, because that kind of brings to the surface a level of accountability for others. And I can remember Skip, who's sitting here to my left in a booth, when we worked together at Nike, designed a training around boundaries. I cannot stress enough that organizations are missing an important area when they don't talk about boundaries. And Skip, years ago, had this wonderful training. And boundaries are really important. And so I think, again, you have to look at where does your support come from? And are you willing, when you bring something into your life, are you willing to give up something? So let's go now to some self-reflection questions. And can I get where are we on time? Someone have the time? Okay. So again, I've mentioned the first bullet, do you receive similar feedback from a variety of people? And I've also mentioned the second one, do you intuitively know that you need to change something but you keep resisting it? The next bullet, the third, can you sit in silence? I mean, I just got cable this month, so you know, it's kind of like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed, all these choices, and then you have to find time to watch all these programs, and Comcast has on demand, and and I just wonder what, it is really important to sit in silence. And I'm also, when my nephews, the 21 and 19-year-old, when I go to my sister's house, the basement, that's kind of their turf, they have surround sound, and I just feel like I'm, shaking from the vibrations. But I think it's really important to have some sort of meditative time where there is silence. But it can be very difficult to sit with our thoughts, or it can be challenging for me, because when I do that, I have to acknowledge this is where I need the growth. Or I may say, well, Tracy, you did great in this area, but oh, that behavior's kind of ugly. So it's really important to learn how to sit in silence, and that's counterintuitive to the Western culture. When we think about technology, music, all these activities, And even when Miles and Nina, we recently signed her up for a tiny hip hoppers class. And I pick them up from school and we go over to Beaumont Grade School where she takes the class, and I bring snacks. Snacks are an important part of our relationship. But I tell them after they eat, now let's kind of just breathe and forego that, let's put the school to rest and just be centered and take some time and get ready for dance class. But again, sitting in the silence. Another is feedback. I notice when we give feedback, people have an immediate response. And that makes me think, wow. So where was the thought? Where was the reflection? Where was the application? And it's one thing if you don't agree, but have you given yourself time? And I'm just amazed how quickly people respond. Or even when I do trainings, I tell people that I train with, let's remember when you ask, are there questions, if you, in 2 seconds, don't move on. People are not comfortable with silence either. So we're not always comfortable sitting in it, and we're not always comfortable maintaining silence. And then the next one is, do you unconditionally give of your time, or do you say, I'll pray for you because that's the most I can do? And this is a really important piece for me because I think it's very important for people who have a knowledge around the importance of helping people to do that in a way that is active. And I sometimes think that little phrase is really a defense that says, I'm not going to take the time. And I'm a big believer that blessings come through the physical movement of others. And when I say that, and I'm just a big believer in the importance of activity. I had a lot of people say, oh, Tracy, you're going to burn yourself up, burn yourself out with your sister and your friend. And for me, it was not a choice. And it was also about that these basically were women I had known all my life. One from 3rd grade and one since my birth, my sister. And I had to recognize within myself what it really required me to do is get rid of some fluff in my life. And I haven't re-invited that fluff back. And I just knew that I would have the staying power for both of them. But again, that was really hard for me when that phrase frequently came up. And then the next one is, can you be vulnerable in front of others? I think we need to show that we are human and that we have feelings. And what I really want to distinguish is with emotional intelligence, we're talking about emotions, and those emotions emotions come quickly. And they can be very passionate emotions, or they can be very quiet emotions versus a mood. A mood really goes on over a longer period of time. But again, can we be vulnerable in front of others? And with both Lori's, I was still working, and there were days when I would just cry, and I would tell people, I am really upset. I cannot talk about it, but I still want all of you to talk around me. And I still want to experience the joys that are going on in your life. Because life still goes on in spite of the challenges that we face. And the last bullet, do we have a consistent spiritual practice that is beyond a time-dedicated service or event? And professionally speaking is a really good example of beyond a time dedicated. Because what I found is it's not that nice and neat in terms of if we're really talking about what our ministry is, what our spiritual practice is. That is really important. And finally, really what I want to say is there was a lot during these 2 journeys, and I can say that especially, when people say it could always be worse, I really learned this along the way. Because at first when my sister was diagnosed, I thought this is horrible. But then I knew she was going to come out of that, and we had that strong faith. But my friend Lori, we were blessed to have 14 months versus the 6 months that the surgeon told her she would have. And so I have really learned through this journey to understand what is important. It has really shaped my life and my practice because I have no problem saying no to requests for silly trainings. I do not want to work with leadership teams that can't get down and dirty and do this work. And when I get calls for a 2-hour training, I graciously say no and hope they find someone who's willing to do that. But I won't, because there's a lot of depth that goes on. And just in closing, again, when I was last night going through my notes and to receive a call from Lori's son, and we were talking through how he's feeling right now, it really reminded me of the importance, again, of self-awareness, and it just doesn't stop. That constantly we will have to really give of ourselves, and sometimes we're tired. But it's really important to be aware of who we are, how we respond. And that's it. I'll take questions if you have it. Steve?
Tracy, in your example, like with your mother or Lori's friend who never went to visit, I'm curious why you call that self-awareness more than social awareness, which is, it's all about me, but the social awareness is, the empathy that you list is about how I'm affecting this other person, this cancer patient.
Just to repeat the question was why it was called self-awareness versus self-empathy in regards to her personal story.
I focus that, Steve, on self-awareness because in those examples, if individuals were in tune with how they felt, and if they could express how they felt, I believe their choice may have been different. So again, it was really about, you see the result of a behavior, but underneath that behavior is a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness. It's an unconscious choice that was made. But to your point, Steve, if we move through this quadrant as building blocks, it has a big impact around social awareness. Any other questions?
When you were struggling with your friend and your sister, did you use any techniques or tools to help you sort of keep reminding yourself of your self-awareness and how you were reacting to this instead of going outside of yourself?
The question was whether or not Tracy used any tools or any kind of ways specifically to get through some of the situations to remind herself of her self-awareness in regards to the struggle that she was going through.
I'm a big reader. I read a lot of books, so I read books. I had a couple girlfriends that were very strong support systems, and I allowed myself to feel. Fortunately, I had done a lot of work in this area, so I was prepared in some ways. I was prepared for my emotions, even when the emotions were new or I didn't think I would feel a particular way, Steve. I felt I had a skill set to handle it. And it's really, for me, it was just, I felt really blessed. It was timing. I have a strong belief in God, and I say God not to minimize if someone calls a God something else, but for me it's God. So prayer is very important, very important.
Tracy, in terms of books, there's an emotional intelligence quick book that allows you to take an assessment. And this book says, this is one of the few books that if you get a low score, that's bad, because it measures emotional intelligence. Have you seen that book or read that book?
The question was whether or not she'd read a book called Emotional Intelligence. It tests your emotional IQ.
Skip, I'm not aware of the one you're mentioning. I know there's a lot of little assessments out on the internet, and I stay clear of assessments that aren't psychometrics tools, because the reliability, the validity is just not there. And I think sometimes what we do is the assessment should really be, if we look back here too around relationships, that's the better self-assessment than just marking a self-assessment. But there's a lot of assessments, and there's a lot of different theories behind emotional intelligence. So the assessment needs to really match up to the theory.
Follow-on question, when Daniel Goleman was asked about that, he said that's all those tests do is measure how well you take the test.
Yeah.
Yeah, at what point, so we're kind of dealing with the situation at work right now. I manage a lot of people in my factory that have friends or spouses even over at a plant that's being affected by a reduction in forces right now. And I know you got to get over the point of, understanding the self-awareness part. When do you move on to the social awareness? Because, these individuals are kind of, worried about their own jobs, and then they've got spouses that are, dealing with their situation as well when they're worried about their own jobs.
The question was, when do you move on from self-awareness to social awareness, given the circumstance of layoffs? And
With behavior, it's not always linear or logical, and you can sometimes have movement back and forth depending on the issue. I think in your case, when you're talking about getting people to social awareness, when in the times of layoffs, people are really stuck. And so what's really important, you have multiple issues around how proactive is the communication from the organization, what sort of support are employees getting in the workplace. Oftentimes, though, there's such a need to kind of figure out how do you balance those who have left and who does the work, that there's not that downtime. And I think it's very challenging to get to social awareness, depending upon, we'd have to talk about the culture of the organization. There's just a lot of issues. And I think with emotional intelligence, I would not even try emotional intelligence at this point, because it really is, it's long-term. You have to look at multiple systems, organizational systems. You'd have to look at behavioral systems, and it's very complex. And that's the point. People don't just get there. It's a journey. And for managers, I would say too, look at, if you want to know how you're probably handling emotions, look at how emotions are handled in your home and how you were raised. Some people were taught be good, be quiet. Others are more animated. And then what's also difficult is if we were looking at the culture, if you're a multicultural organization, that looks different as well. But usually in times of layoffs, what goes? Budget for the need for training and interventions, right? Yeah. And it can be really overwhelming for managers to deal with kind of the layers of emotions if they don't have that ability. It's like we would talk about business, but in business we forget that they're people, and we don't deal with the social sciences and the psychology around human behavior.
you did a great job.
Thank you.